Right. Well, we're nearing 80 plus participants now, and a few more are now trickling in. Amazing. So it's always wonderful to see the diverse community of people who come to these food thinkers. So let me get underway and go. Welcome. My name is Dr. Christian Reynolds, and tonight we have Professor Andrea Freeman talking about food oppression. Let's first go through a few bits more of housekeeping to let the last few guests settle in and get settled in before we go to the talk. So I just want to highlight that this is a monthly or regular series of food thinkers, which is available both tonight live and will be available via the Centre for Food Policy's YouTube channel after the event. Likewise, if you would like to receive the monthly newsletter from the Centre for Food Policy, as well as event updates, you can sign up to our mailing list, which my colleague Elaine is about to paste into the chat box now. I also mentioned earlier that we have the MSc in Food Policy, and the applications are open for our Masters in Food Policy, which I teach on along with Professor Corinna Hawkes, who isn't here this evening. We also have a new BSc in Nutrition and Food Policy, which is, again, a really exciting course. So if you're looking at upgrading your skills or beginning your journey in food policy, definitely come and talk to us at City University of London. You can find details of both programs for the MSc in Food Policy, as well as the BSc in Nutrition and Food Policy on the City University of London website. And you can find the details in the link below there. As I've said already, the webinar is being recorded and made available afterwards via YouTube. Please do tweet and please do talk to us. So there's a hashtag of #foodthinkers, and the handle is @foodpolicycity to talk to us over that. Please do tweet, please do engage. We love to see those things. My own handle is @sartorialfoodie. Now, within behavior within the webinar this evening, could you please write any questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. So there are different little buttons beside if you're on a computer or if you're on a modular device. These will be read out by me to Andrea after she's given the talk. We'll try to respond to all of your questions in time if available, but as we know, Food Thinkers does get heated with many, many questions, but we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. So do ask them into the Q&A early, and we'll try and triage and get as many of them through as possible. And I'm going to look forward to that questions and answer session. I'm also personally looking forward to the next Food Thinkers webinar, which is going to be on the 17th of May, when Kimberly Bell will be talking about her experiences of setting up a small independent bakery in Nottingham, England. We also have, spoiler, some amazing food thinkers coming up over the next couple of months as well, but I'll wait till they're publicly released to tell you about that. But I am so excited. There are some amazing guests coming up. But let's focus on the amazing guest this evening. So Andrea Freeman is a professor of law and Carl Smith Ball faculty scholar at the University of Hawaii William S. Richardson School of Law. She's also a Fulbright King's College London research scholar and is currently studying food inequality in the UK. So it's lovely to be talking to her from the same time zone. Andrea writes and researches at the intersection of critical race theory and food policy, health and consumer credit. She's also the author of multiple books, including Ruin Their Crops on the Ground in 2023 and Skimmed, Breastfeeding, Race and Injustice, which was published in 2019. And both of these are available from all good bookstores and online. Finally, her Twitter handle is @AFreemanLawProf. Please do follow her. She posts some amazing things. So now let us sit back and put your thinking caps on, and let's hear Professor Andrea Freeman talk about food oppression. Please take it away, Andrea. I'm so excited.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you to everyone involved in this program, Elaine, Lindy, Corinna, Lucy. I'm delighted to be here sharing my work on food oppression today. And most of the work that I'm going to present is focused on the US, but I am here in London doing my Fulbright research, and I'm hoping that what I share with everybody today will inspire you to think of examples of food oppression that's happening here, and that you'll share them with me. And you can always reach me through that Twitter handle or through my email address at the University of Hawaii. So food oppression is facially neutral food-related law, policy, or practice that creates health disparities along race, gender, and class lines. The food, agricultural, and pharmaceutical industry's influence over government policy drives these disparities. And cultural myths about personal responsibility that ignore the structural determinants of what we eat, as well as racial stereotypes about laziness and poor choices, make these disparities seem natural when they're not. In the US, poor diet has overtaken smoking as the primary cause of early deaths. And there are racial disparities in all the food-related conditions, illnesses, and deaths from those sicknesses. So here's a few charts to look at: diabetes, heart disease, cancer, strokes, high blood pressure, and obesity. And there are similar racial health disparities in the UK. And today I'm going to talk about what I consider to be 4 of the main drivers of these health disparities in the US. So the USDA nutrition programs, including the school lunch program, the outsized presence of fast food in schools, public schools, and poor neighborhoods, race-targeted food marketing, and the government's crusade to get rid of the milk surplus. So let's start with milk and white supremacy. These are protesters at a New York anti-Trump art installation called "He Will Not Divide Us." Here, neo-Nazis are dancing shirtless, chugging their jugs of milk, and they said that this action demonstrated their opposition to the vegan agenda. Milk also entered the Twitterverse, replacing Pepe the Frog as the emoji symbolizing white superiority in the Twitter names of newsworthy white supremacists. So here's Lawrence Fox, 2021 London mayoral candidate and actor. This is Richard Spencer, president of the National Policy Institute, and he coined the term alt-right. This is a social media personality called Baked Alaska, who took part in the January 6th Capitol riots. And these are some examples of some of the white nationalist websites with this poem, as you can see, a map tracking lactose intolerance around the world. And for movie fans, in the wonderful film Get Out, there's a terrifying scene where white supremacist slowly sips on her glass of milk while eating her Fruit Loops separately so that she won't destroy the drink's purity. And this association between white supremacy and milk is quite old. In the 1920s, this is a National Dairy Council pamphlet telling us about how people who use milk are progressive in science and every activity of the human intellect. 1933, this history of agriculture in New York talks about how the Aryans, who are the heaviest drinkers of milk and the greatest users of butter and cheese, have a quick and high development. So this link between white supremacy and milk is alarming, not just in itself, but in light of the US government's efforts to ensure that milk is a dominant part of people's diets, even when milk makes people sick. So milk consumption is linked to quite a few serious illnesses and conditions, including several types of cancer, heart disease, multiple sclerosis, and cognitive decline. And it's also responsible for the less serious condition of lactose intolerance. And the majority of almost every racial group in the US, except for white people from Northern Europe and Scandinavia, suffer from lactose intolerance. And even that name, lactose intolerance, has a racial bias, because most people don't retain the enzyme lactase, which digests lactose beyond childhood. When you don't have it, you experience pain, discomfort, and other digestive symptoms when you drink milk. And some white people are an exception to this. So Northern Europeans who had to adapt to a cold, hostile climate by drinking their herd's milk developed the ability to retain the enzyme lactase and passed it down to their descendants. So with the majority of people in most other groups unable to digest milk, it would make more sense to call people who can digest it lactose persistent. Instead, whiteness forms the baseline of normal, and any deviation from it is labeled abnormal and undesirable. And this framing supports a false idea of white physical superiority, and it supports the USDA's efforts, that's the Department of Agriculture, to promote milk as a food that's generally good, even though medical and scientific research tells us otherwise. So since the 1930s, when the federal government began to subsidize certain foods during the Great Depression, the US has been committed to supporting dairy farmers. The first Farm Bill in 1933 had the twin goals of supporting US agriculture and alleviating hunger. And it accomplished these goals by subsidizing foods that were filling, leading to the overproduction of some foods, like corn, wheat, soy, meat, and dairy, while neglecting to support others, like fruits and vegetables. And although this New Deal strategy did succeed in reducing food insecurity at the time, flooding the market with non-nutritious, high-calorie foods contributed to the next wave of food-related public health crises, obesity and type 2 diabetes. And because of the power that the agricultural corporations who produce these subsidized commodities were able to amass throughout the 20th century, these subsidies have stayed the same and have not adapted to our new food needs. But because there's not enough demand for these commodities, the USDA is mandated with buying the surplus that they create and then getting rid of it in any way they can. And in 1977, President Jimmy Carter vowed to increase the price of milk to 6 cents a gallon. So the government bought surplus milk, but it couldn't store the milk for very long, so it bought cheese. And then after every cold storage in the United States was filled with cheese, the government rented half an acre in a Kansas cave and filled it from floor to ceiling with cheese. Eventually, the US had 2 pounds of stored cheese for every one of its residents. Now, the government sent powdered milk to people in other countries who had trouble digesting it as foreign aid, but they couldn't transport cheese overseas. So instead, they come up with the idea of delivering it to poor neighborhoods, a plan that wouldn't affect the price of milk because the people who got it wouldn't be able to afford to buy it. So rappers like Kendrick Lamar and Jay-Z measure their success by their distance from government cheese. And bringing large quantities of cheese into Black and brown communities made the racial disparities in milk-related diseases, conditions, and deaths worse. But the USDA keeps doing it as people continue to drink less and less milk. As the white population declines, so does milk drinking. We're having fewer children, and children tend to drink more milk than adults. Before the pandemic, people were eating out more, and they didn't usually order milk as their drink in a restaurant. Then when schools and restaurants closed down under lockdown, even though there were some people at home who wanted to drink more milk, dairy farmers had to dump their excess milk because there was no easy way to shift from distributing and transporting small orders instead of large ones. Now the USDA is sending cheese to food banks that are trying to help people cope with the food insecurity that has surged with the pandemic. And this excess cheese contributes to the underlying conditions of type 2 diabetes and obesity that partially account for the racial disparities in cases and deaths from COVID. So while medical professionals and the CDC ignored the structural causes of these disparities, they were encouraging Black and Latinx communities to eat better, while the USDA continued to dump free cheese into their communities to help the dairy industry. UK food banks also disproportionately serve Black and other ethnic minority communities. And the USDA uses its dairy marketing branch, which is called DMI, and is funded by a dairy checkoff program to get people to drink more milk. And one of the ways it does this is by teaming up with fast food companies. So the USDA's DMI is behind Taco Bell's grilled cheese burrito. And the USDA developed marketing that promises the first thing you'll notice is this impressive pressed cheese exterior with all its melted grilled goodness. Then after biting in, your taste buds will be swept away by the nacho cheese sauce and shredded cheeses on the inside. The grilled cheese burrito makes a statement that cheese is meant for literally everywhere. A world with more cheese in it is a good thing, and a world with more cheese on it is a game changer. So DMI also helped McDonald's create a line of milky coffee drinks called frappes. It got Pizza Hut to add 25% more cheese to its pan pizzas and then gave 500,000 of those away. In 2008, DMI teamed up with Domino's Pizza to create a line of 7 cheese pizzas called American Legends. And the $12 million marketing campaign for this pizza line included a coveted spot in the Super Bowl. DMI created Taco Bell's steak quesadilla, Pizza Hut's Cheesy Bites pizza, Burger King's cheesy bacon tender crisp chicken. And in 2015, DMI helped McDonald's switch from margarine to butter, increasing butter consumption in the US by 600 million pounds. That's our type of pound. So although everyone pays the price for the increase of dairy and fast food, this price or the cost of this is highest for people who live in food swamps, neighborhoods that are saturated by fast food outlets. And here's a UK version of a food swamp. And although white people eat more fast food overall, makes up a bigger portion of the diets of people who live in low-income Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. So DMI also created this award-winning ad campaign called Got Milk in 1993. It lasted more than 20 years, and it features celebrities wearing milk mustaches. So here's Serena Williams, Sophie Vergara, Beyonce, Chris Brown, Usher, Muhammad Ali, lots of stars. And when director Spike Lee appeared in a magazine with a milk mustache, anti-milk activists labeled him a race traitor. DMI ran a campaign for 4 years claiming that drinking milk would make you lose weight without any evidence to back up this claim. It collaborated with the National Football League, that's our kind of football, to create a marketing campaign aimed at public school students called Gen Youth. So Gen Youth has an app that lets kids earn points to become an ambassador at a special student summit where they meet NFL players. And they earn points to do this by doing activities like making cheese and making milkshakes and collecting coins in milk jugs to give food banks so they can buy milk. And in 2019, 81% of the kids who are eligible for free lunch, who are disproportionately students of color, participated in this Gen Youth program. Now, the USDA's dietary guidelines call for 3 servings of milk a day, which is twice the amount that people are consuming right now. And these guidelines are the equivalent of the Eat Well Guide, which also gives prominence to dairy, despite a large portion of the population not being able to digest it. The Dairy Council in the UK promotes milk as a good source of protein. And on the US My Plate, dairy has its own separate section. All of this is political. Now, the federal dietary guidelines are important because they guide the contents of the USDA nutrition programs, like the National School Lunch Program. So schools have a special milk program, and if any public school student in the US, including the 80% of Black and Indigenous students who are lactose intolerant, want to drink plant-based milk instead of cow's milk at school, they have to go to a doctor and get a diagnosis that they have a disability. So let's talk about school lunches now. The USDA wants you to think that school lunches look like this, but they actually look like this. And this is a takeaway lunch from a Buffalo school district during the pandemic. There's another nice school lunch. Now, people also complain about school lunches in the UK during COVID, with Jamie Oliver calling them bland and beige. And people complain about the inadequacy of school lunches here. Generally, here's another beige school lunch. Okay. Now, as another part of the New Deal, the US government funded programs in the 30s, hiring cooks to make meals and serve them in schools across the country. So by 1942, the school meal programs were feeding 6 million students. But after the US joined World War II, surplus food was diverted to feed troops instead. At that time, 40% of draft rejections were because of poor nutrition. And that motivated Congress to officially create the National School Lunch Program in 1946 as a matter of national security. But now, by 2009, obesity was responsible for a large percentage of military recruit rejections. Now, the USDA gives surplus commodities away to schools for free. And when these commodities enter the school meals, they take the form of corn dogs, chicken nuggets, tater tots, sausage links, and pizza. And these processed foods contribute to high rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes, which Black and Latinx children suffer from at greater rates than white children. And in addition to contributing to these racial health disparities, the school lunch program contributes to food insecurity because of the stigma that's attached to the free school meals. So some students whose families don't qualify or sign up for this program, they can't afford to pay for lunch, and they have to endure lunch shaming from cafeteria workers. Sometimes they humiliate them by tossing out their full lunch trays. They'll write on their bodies. They'll make them perform chores in the cafeteria, or they'll give them a cold sandwich instead of a hot lunch. So many of these students prefer going hungry to putting up with this kind of abuse. And in 2020, a Pennsylvania school district sent this letter home with students whose families owed $10 in lunch debt, threatening to have their children sent to a foster home. And when this happened, the district refused offers to pay off the students' debts. So some students suffer from lunch shaming and food insecurity, while others develop obesity and diabetes from the diets that the schools feed them just to get rid of the surplus commodities. And lunch shaming seems to be an issue in the UK as well as underfunding for school food and allowing food service corporations to profit at the expense of students' health. Now, many students in the United States rely on school meals for most or all of their daily calories. And the US government provides further support for unhealthy eating at school by determining that pizza can count as a vegetable. It also allows fast food companies to engage in intensive marketing to public school students. So teachers give out coupons for fast food as a reward for good grades. They distribute materials like safety guides with fast food coupons inside, and students in classes that raise the most money during parent-teacher drives earn fast food prizes. There's fast food on school buses, on school boards, school signs, school games, and school fundraisers are held at fast food places. And this pervasive marketing contradicts our expectation that schools will look after the physical well-being of our children. It disproportionately affects students of color who attend public schools at higher rates than white students and participate more often in the USDA school lunch and breakfast programs. Fast food marketing also directly targets youth of color. But these young people are extremely attractive to the fast food companies because they tend to spend more money on fast food than their white peers. And they're considered to be trendsetters, definers of what is or will soon be considered cool. They also overwhelmingly have cell phones, even when their families cannot afford computers or tablets at home. Fast food companies track the location of cell phones and deliver coupons to customers when they're within a few blocks of their outlets. And in many food swamps, young people are always within a few blocks of a fast food place, and of course, always on their phones. And when they get into McDonald's, they're encouraged to become brand ambassadors and do their own free advertising for the company by sending out a snap on Snapchat with the McDonald's logo and messages in the frame. Kids can also engage in this type of free marketing while they're texting. And for even younger kids, there are racially targeted McDonald's games and apps. Now, if the USDA wanted to counter these kinds of marketing tactics, they could do so even without regulating the industry, which they're very reluctant to do. 8th graders who perceived healthy eating as an act of social justice made better food choices. And these students acted in defiance against corporations that market to vulnerable children and engineer junk food to make it addictive. Appealing to their values of autonomy and social consciousness was more effective than teaching them about long-term health consequences. But the USDA is unlikely to fund this kind of truth campaign because it would go directly against the agency's own interests. Now, most of the fast food industry's political contributions go to Republicans. We've just finished the reign of our fast food president, and you have your own fast food leader here. Now, racial stereotypes disguise the impact of government action on health disparities. The media often portrays Indigenous, Black, and Latinx people as overweight, as lazy, and as weak-willed. And the myth of personal responsibility casts individuals as if they're in complete control of their diet, when in reality, food choices are constrained by external and structural circumstances. Now, some food marketing is openly racist. In her book, Burgers in Blackface, Na Oyo Kwate discusses the relationship between racism and anti-Blackness by explaining that white people see Black people as naturally affiliated with food in a way that contributes to the success of 4 racist restaurants. So this is in Seattle, Washington. This is a restaurant in Natchez, Mississippi. This is in Santa Barbara. And this is Richard's Restaurant and Slave Market in Berwyn, Illinois, which was a sundown town, which had a curfew. Kwate argues that white people also enjoy consuming food shaped by or branded with racist stereotypes. But after the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, some corporations respond to the call for racial justice by getting rid of or reconsidering their racist brands. So Pepsi, which owns Quaker Oats, announced the retirement of Aunt Jemima in June 2020. Now, the company had borrowed this character from a minstrel song in the late 1800s and put her on its pancake syrup to help soothe white fears about Black people's entry into society after emancipation. And this mammy mascot allowed white people to continue their ownership of a Black woman, or slave in a box, for 130 years. And not surprisingly, this brand was never popular among Black consumers. Now, Pepsi also committed to investing over $400 million into Black communities and expanding Black managerial roles at its company. Then in September 2020, Mars Corporation announced it would change its Uncle Ben's brand to Ben's Original and remove this image from its packaging. Ben was a Black servant mascot created in 1946 to sell rice. And although he was later promoted to being chair of the board, he continued to symbolize Black servitude. Mars also announced a $2 million investment in culinary scholarships for aspiring Black chefs and investments into nutritional and education programs. Now, both Pepsi and Mars were responding to research that shows that the majority of consumers do care about a brand's politics. And up to 80% of consumers would stop using a product if they disagreed with the company's response to a specific issue. Black consumers take a brand's value into account when deciding what to purchase more than any other consumer group. So in this same time period, Nestle, which is problematic on many levels, paused production on its Eskimo pies while rethinking this 100-year-old branding, and then became Edie's Pie instead on October 2nd. In June, Nestle said it would stop selling under this Colombian brand, Beso de Negra, and then it's rebranding its Australian-based Chicos and Redskins. Conagra says it's going to rebrand Mrs. Butterworth syrup, although the company first tried to avoid rebranding by changing her shape to look less like a mammy figure. B&G is looking at changing its cream of wheat branding. So Chef Rastus was the product's mascot when it went onto market in 1890. And Rastus is a racial slur. In 1925, B&G replaced the chef with a photo of professional chef Frank White, but he is still cheerfully serving white people. He appears in an episode of Lovecraft Country, if anybody wants to talk about that show. Now, other racist brands were retired before George Floyd's murder. So Land of Lakes, this was their brand up to 2020. This is it in 1969. This is just a whole bunch of brands that you kind of can't believe ever existed. Frito Bandito, we had Crazy Horse malt liquor become Crazy Stallion malt liquor, and shredded wheat ads, Kellogg's cereal ads, but there's still plenty of racist brands that haven't been retired. So Miss Chiquita, who evolved from a banana into a person, but still a very stereotypical one, and Trader Joe's, who was challenged, Trader Joe's, very beloved United States company. They considered rebranding their specialty foods, but then they decided actually they're not racist. Maybe because they include a French product, not sure, but I think they were the inspiration for these offensive products in the movie Sausage Party. Now, another type of racist marketing is cultural appropriation or exploitation, where a product will make a white person cooler because of their proximity as a consumer to Blackness. Here's Ashton Kutcher in brown face. So there's a series of ads here with rappers. There's Pitbull for Bud Light, Pitbull for Dr. Pepper, old school rappers for Sprite, LeBron James, and this limited edition Travis Scott action figure that sold for $55,000. The rapper partnered with McDonald's to create several products with his name and their brand, including this chicken nugget pillow, tote bag, and lunchbox. Burger King has a Lucha Libre campaign, and there are race-targeted websites. This is from McDonald's, and this one is from Wendy's. Sprite put out a Black Lives Matter ad, trying to capitalize on the movement. Now, this is part of a phenomenon that's called woke washing, where profit-driven companies use progressive-oriented marketing campaigns to deflect questions about their ethics. And this type of race-targeted soft drink marketing contributes significantly to the high rates, hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself, of type 2 diabetes and obesity among communities of color that is so problematic. So if they really cared about racial justice, they would just stop this type of marketing. Now, the flip side of marketing unhealthy food to communities of color is marketing healthy food only to white communities. So you already know that I don't consider milk to be a healthy food, but I think it's promoted that way. And this is a flagrant example of white targeted marketing. This is from the US and this is from the UK. This is Jamie Lee Curtis for yogurt, Jennifer Aniston for Smart Water, Jane Lynch for coconut water, and some Olympic athletes for soy milk. Now, marketing healthier products to white people adds to the myth that healthy eating is only for white people. And this myth reinforces the racist stereotypes that stand in the way of providing resources and making policy choices to reduce racial health disparities. The stereotypes also affect medical and healthcare treatment. Racial stereotypes played a part in justifying enslavers' failure to give the people that they enslaved sufficient food or health care. And unhealthy diets imposed on enslaved people created health disparities that still exist today, even though the types of food illnesses have changed. Okay, now finally, let's talk about a program, another USDA program that links food oppression during colonization to food oppression today. And that is the Federal Distribution Program for Indian Reservations. Now, the USDA wants you to think that this program is this, but it's actually this. Subsidized commodity foods dominate the program. The first populations to experience nutrition-related illnesses were Indigenous people, because colonization involved the deliberate destruction of traditional foodways. After taking office, President Washington vowed to ruin their crops on the ground and prevent them planting more. And this policy led to mass starvation. Later, President Jackson ironically justified the 1830 Indian Removal Act that authorized the forced dislocation of Indigenous people along the Trail of Tears by the fact that their land could no longer support their way of life after the damage done by US theft and occupation. After destroying Indigenous food sources, the US offered Indigenous nations rations instead, but it wielded these rations as a weapon, withholding them from families who resisted their children's removal to boarding schools, rejected Christianity, or failed to form families according to the Western model. And the 1862 Dakota War, which was sparked by the deliberate withholding of rations, ended with President Lincoln ordering the execution of 38 Dakota men, which was the largest mass execution in United States history. When the US did provide rations, they were made up of low quality and unfamiliar foods. The government deliberately left traditional foods out of assistance packages, trying to steer Indigenous people toward a civilized lifestyle. Then in 1949, to help reduce the surplus of subsidized commodities, the government began sending them to reservations. And FDPIR became an official program in 1977. Now, Indigenous people have more type 2 diabetes than any other racial or ethnic group. This condition leads to paralysis, amputation, and blindness. The Indigenous rate of deaths from diabetes is 177% higher than in any other group. Indigenous adults are diagnosed with obesity 60% more often than white adults. And on the Dakota Reservation, life expectancy for males is between 40 and 50 years old, as opposed to 76 in the general population. Indigenous people have higher infection rates and 2 times the deaths from COVID than white people. And some of this is because of their higher rates of underlying high risk factors like obesity and diabetes. Now, commons is another name for these boxes, and they've contributed significantly to these disparities. Activist Charles Red Gates gave testimony in 1991 about these boxes. I'm quoting him. "Did you ever see what's in these cans?" This guy said, "No, show us, we want to see." So I grabbed a can of pork and I told him, "You're going to get a bad smell. It doesn't smell good. It doesn't look good when I open it. So you take a look." I got a can of chicken, a can of beef, and a can of pork. And the first one I opened, everybody crowded around. I opened it up, and as soon as I opened up, a couple of them backed away and grabbed their noses and mouths. When I began to dump it out, they both ran outside and threw up. That's what they were giving us. And I showed them all the connective tissue, the blood vessels. It was some pretty terrible stuff. Now, because the proteins and the produce in the boxes are often undesirable or inedible, many recipients will only eat the sugar and the carbs. And the boxes are supposed to reflect the dietary guidelines. So Bernard and Brown describe the guidelines as amounting to, perhaps inadvertently, the nutritional equivalent of smallpox infected blankets. This is because of the USDA's allegiance to the food and agricultural industries. Now, Karuk ceremonial leader Leif Hillman calls nutritional colonialism through FDPIR a modern extension of tribal termination and genocide. The USDA says the boxes aren't great, but they're only supplemental. But a third of the program's participants rely on them for all their food. Now, commods and their effects are so pervasive that for some people, they're wrapped up in a pan-tribal Indian identity that bridge gaps between indigenous nations, because only an Indian can have a commod bod. Dana Vantries writes about how popular commodity cheese is across indigenous communities. This is musician Wade Fernandez, who's a member of the Menominee tribe and sings a song called Commodity Cheese Blues. I went downtown to the commod shop, met the blues because they were out of stock. Tell me please when I'll get my commod cheese. Visa cheese is an expression that means a mode of exchange in which block of commodity cheese can purchase other goods or services. And 2006 Indian Country Today article observed, some Lakotas still say to this day that the only brick of gold the Lakota people got out of the Black Hills is the brick of cheese rationed out on Commodity Day. Aside from being highly processed, commodity cheese is aggravating for people who are lactose intolerant and leads to the other serious health conditions that I showed earlier linked to dairy consumption. Now, maybe the most controversial commodity food, is fry bread. Now, this is very delicious. For those of you who have not tried it yet, you must. It was created out of the need to convert flour, sugar, and oil into something palatable. And for some people, it's a unifying symbol. But fry bread has also become emblematic of bad health and a focal point of outsiders who attribute the high rates of diabetes in indigenous communities to bad choices. So this is Keith Sikola, a famous Ojibwe singer who says fry bread has killed more Indians than the federal government. Susan Sean Harjo here, a Cheyenne and Muskogee activist, launched a debate in 2005 by publicly resolving to stop eating fry bread. And she said, if fry bread were a movie, it would be hardcore porn, no redeeming qualities, zero nutrition. Fry bread's not a traditional food, but it's sometimes treated as one, but it is a symbol of resistance to the disregard to indigenous health that's demonstrated by the sad contents of the boxes. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop talking about the program there. It's a very clear continuation of the use of food to oppress indigenous communities because it's directly designed for them. But the other USDA programs that the agency uses to dispose of commodity foods also contribute to racial health disparities because Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities disproportionately participate in them. And I suspect that in the UK, as in the US, the role that food has played in history largely explains why it's so embedded in a racist social system and why racial justice and food justice are so intertwined. So I want to stop my talking now and start engaging in discussion with you about this. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Andrea. It was fascinating to hear your different examples from milk through to cheese and the overproduction and the supply of government cheese, through to the different commod boxes and fry bread. I still haven't tried fry bread since our last discussion, but I doubt in London that I'm going to get something that authentic on this side of the pond, probably. But there we go. Next time I'm over in the States, I will see what happens. But thank you very much. We have some questions coming in. I encourage anybody out there, please put your questions into the chat below. I can see so many parallels between different government policies, either intentionally or unintentionally, producing outcomes which are negative health impacts for different demographics, whether it was a policy designed for a specific demographic or it's been designed as a clearinghouse, as you've put it, for, say, cheese, being able to move cheese. And from my own work in terms of sustainability, I just see that and go, gosh, the carbon footprint of all that. So amazing from many different levels. But we have a flurry of questions and I should stop being so self-indulgent. So can we start at the beginning of your talk? So you've highlighted there in terms of school meals and students becoming empowered with, if they become empowered with social justice, they're making healthier food choices. So a few of the different people have asked questions around food literacy. And so there are organizations in the UK such as Bite Back and other organizations that are talking, and say Tasted, which are thinking around equipping people with food literacy skills, or students with food literacy skills. So I guess for starters, how do you feel about that overlap between food oppression and food literacy and food education? Is there any sweet spots there in terms of your work and your thoughts?
Thanks so much. That's such an important and interesting question. And I think, food literacy, that's a new phrase for me, but it does sound very important. And I think, everybody should have access to knowledge of all kinds. Knowledge is power. My only hesitation is that sometimes that kind of emphasis on education or literacy, which I'm assuming is the same thing, obscures the fact that choice is very limited.
Mhm.
Because there's an implication in education efforts that if only people knew what to eat, they'd eat the right food, right? When in fact, we're completely constrained by budget, access, time, resources like kitchens, all kinds of things, right? Where we're getting our meals. Are we getting them at school? Are we getting them at home? Are we getting them in the corner? What's at the corner, right? So that more than anything, I think, defines, and just structures what we eat. So the literacy is so important, but we can't let that overshadow the need to do structural reforms so that once a person wants to make different choices, the choices are possible.
Thank you. That's a really good point in terms of enabling and empowering, I guess. Again, please do put questions into the chat. We've got a few. I've got see some other people are putting stuff towards the chat. Please put it into the question and answers. Just following on, one of the people who was asking around this food education with food oppression was asking around, I guess, as you mentioned, empowerment. Are there specific notes for social media or for broadcasting with empowerment? How can we actually broadcast more this knowledge around food oppression and on social media or empowerment? Are there specific notes or specific resonances that are there in the US that we could also be using in the UK or in any other part of the global food system?
I'm trying to understand the question. You're saying,
So
yeah.
are there specific topics or things that are being resonant from your research, engaging with children or other groups, that are the things that people click with and realize that?
Yeah, I think something that people really don't know is how much power corporations have over things like schools and nutrition programs, because I think there's an idea that, okay, yes, corporations, they're profit driven, they market, their advertising is bad, we should stay away, we can like counter teach it. But people don't know how much they've infiltrated food policy, schools, environments where we think that we're safe. And also that example that I gave about kids, and once they start to understand that they're being manipulated by corporations, they actually make different choices, right? So you think, my taste is this, that's why I eat it, because I like it, right? But once you start to realize, maybe I like it because, I don't know, they spend billions on putting salt, sugar, and fat together so that I'll become addicted to it, or in donating to public schools so that they can put the McDonald's logo in, on the classroom desk or whatever it is, right? Then suddenly your taste starts to change. So I think just that understanding and that rejection of corporate influence into programs that are supposed to be designed for health and well-being that we put our tax dollars into, I think that's like a vital first step.
No, thank you. That's a really clear way of saying it. So thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions now coming in about subsidies and redesigning different bits of policy, specifically in the US, or applying that to the UK. But before I go to that, I'm going to do a slightly cheeky curveball here. Still while we're in the milk section of your talk, if that's okay. And thinking about, I guess, Linda Mayhew's raised the topic of breastfeeding and breast milk. Within different societies. And I've been working with, say, the London Breast Milk Centre here, and just thinking about different demographics in both the States, in the UK, around the barriers and cultural stigma of breastfeeding, all of those things. Have you been thinking in that area at all in regards to maternal health?
Yeah, well, I think as you mentioned up front, I've written a book about that. So my first book, which is called Skimmed, is about the disparities in the United States between Black women and Black communities, Black breastfeeding people, or Black parents, and other communities, and how low the rates are. And so if I can just say a little bit about it, there's a story that's central to the book, and it's about some quadruplets who were born in the 40s in North Carolina to a Black and Cherokee woman who could not speak or hear. And she had 6 kids already. She was married to a tenant farmer. And then she surprisingly had these quadruplets, and her white doctor decided to name the quadruplets after his own family members and to use them for experiments that he was doing on vitamin C. And so as part of his effort to stay close with his family, he sold off the rights to the girls to the highest bidding formula company to use in their promotional materials. And eventually the result of this is very sad. He arranges to have them taken away from their family and basically controls them and keeps them poor throughout their lives. But they become the poster children for Pet Milk Formula Company. And it's the first time that Black models are used for anything but beauty products or cigarettes, or alcohol. And there's this massive marketing campaign directed at Black families that helps and contributes to the disparities in breastfeeding rates that also have to do with history of enslavement, that have to do with employment policies, just a real mix of social, cultural, and political factors. But I go really in depth there, and that came out of my thinking about milk and the commodification of milk, the marketing of milk, and the racialization of milk.
Oh, thank you, and please, I encourage all of you to pick up the book from all good booksellers. I've started; it's on the bedside table. I'm reading it at the moment since our last discussions. Right, we could stay with that topic for ages, but there's so many questions coming in now, so thank you. Please do keep putting them into the chat, everybody. I'm sorry, put them into the questions and answer box, not the chat box. We're trying to triage them there. So let's change tack slightly now. So you've been working as a Fulbright scholar in the UK for the last series of months. You're over here now. Do you see any major differences in the way that your ideas around food oppression operate in the UK with respect to structural racism or national history, how things are changing? How are things different on this side of the pond?
Yeah, that is really what I'm just digging into. So I've really only been here 6 weeks. So I'm just kind of getting my toes in the water with understanding the way things are. But one of the main differences that I've learned so far is just the way people think about racism and structural racism and sort of critical race theory and all of the things that I'm very steeped in the United States that I came over here expecting to see a UK version of, but I'm not seeing that. So I'm seeing the conversations happening in a different way, maybe not as explicit. So I'm seeing the same effects, differing health outcomes, but I'm just not seeing that critical race analysis. And so while that is like distressing to me. It's also exciting to me that I see that. I think that the more I learn, that I may be bringing something of value over here, this food oppression framework, to start thinking about these problems here. So the only thing that I've really started looking at is the school lunch. You know, I gave you a few of those those interesting cartoons and tweets and things. I mean, it's clearly a very heated debate over here. And again, I'm not seeing a lot of racialized discussion about it, but it is happening. I know it's happening, and I'm excited to learn a lot more about that.
Thank you very much. And I would encourage all of the audience members, please, if you have your own thoughts and ideas on food oppression, how it's happening within the UK, please do reach out to Andrea over her email at Hawaii, or go onto her Twitter, which we've mentioned earlier, and we can again put in the chat if people want to. Just because I think there are so many similarities in terms of, say, the COVID boxes. That was the thing that highlighted me, the COVID aid packages that we received in different parts of the country, or and how different those were, and substandard nutrition. And I know one of my ex-colleagues, Geraldine McNeil up in Aberdeen, she did a bit of work looking at that with her own COVID aid package when it arrived, and breaking down the nutrition there. So definitely, I feel there's so many different things, but I encourage all the different participants. You know, we have over 90 to 100 people on the call at the moment. Please do write in and talk to Andrea about your views on this. Hopefully I'm not going to have you flooded your inbox, Andrea.
I love it.
With that in mind, so thinking about both the UK and the USA and other places, you've raised the dairy industry as being one of the large corporate powers or lobby groups, etc., who have control, say, of have input into different dietary guidelines and different policies through a historic lens. But just thinking about that, so a couple of people have raised dairy in particular here, and thinking about there's a reducing number of dairy farmers, and dairy farmers as a community are finding it quite tough in most places. So where is the power actually? There's large herds, small amounts of holdings now, but is the political power now with the dairy processors as the big dairy, rather than it being dairy farmers as well? And who are those people? Is that I guess people are asking, where in the food industry is the oppression coming from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's so interesting because we hold up the farmer, the sort of like traditional idea of the farmer, right, as a symbol of something important that we want to save, right? And most people don't realize or have a vision of what farming really is, especially in the United States, that is, because of the subsidies, it's all about these large industries. It's not a personal business, right? And it's not a supply and demand situation at all, right? We're trying to save an industry that naturally would be reduced because of the reduction in demand, but we haven't seen that sort of like straightforward market economics happening for almost 100 years now, right? Because the government is propping it up and not allowing the market to determine what the supply is. And so people's natural expression of this is not a product I want, it has no place in that, right? And I think it's correct to identify those large corporations and the processors, and especially when you also think about other subsidies, right? You think about like Cargill and all these other big processing corporations as really benefiting and being in control. And there is a lot of exploitation along the supply chain too. So I'm not going to talk about that in depth right now, but I believe that's absolutely right.
Thank you for that. Just staying with milk, and I guess that the thoughts around the tensions on the supply chain, there's also, I guess, this thing of what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. So demonization of certain food types for not eating, and that can be also class-based. So we have two questioners who are asking, I guess, sorry, I'm trying to meld two questions on the fly here, which is always tricky, but there's demonization of certain foods in either policy or in cultural demonization. So these could be things that people shouldn't eat for specific reasons. And does that contribute to either oppression or social division? Or have you thought in terms of food, instead of it being forced to eat, it's forcing people not to eat certain foods through the policies?
Yeah, I mean, so it's something I'd want to get more into detail about, because it really depends on what those foods are, right? I mean, if they're cultural foods, right? So, people who are not white eat these foods and then they're demonized and not considered, so that's very standard in the US, that there's a definition of like an American diet, and to be American, you eat cheeseburgers and fries, you don't eat, dal and I don't know, whatever, like you don't eat grits, and you don't eat just any kind of foods belonging to anything other than this perhaps imagined American, food thing. And so that that's oppressive, of course, right? But also this question reminds me of thinking again about breast milk and like pressure. Is it, well, if you say, well, breast milk is the healthiest, and if you don't do that, it's bad, formula is bad, right? I mean, that's very problematic too. So I think that what's key in all of this is the idea of choice and access, right? I'm not here to judge people's choices, but I'm here to say everybody should have access to the same range of choice, and then, it's on you.
Good point there in terms of empowering and creating a positive food environment which is equal for all or equitable for all. So I'm going to go on to a more USDA specific question, but before I do, we've had a couple of different questions of people not asking questions, but saying, do you know about the school milk program? And I think a lot of people have the trauma associated. They're saying drinking warm milk in the UK school. So I think multiple people are wanting to share their lived trauma with you of having to drink semi-warmed milk that the UK schools from the 1940s onwards, so Boyd Orr, etc., making sure that everybody, to stop rickets, of course, made sure to get milk to everybody in the UK, but that milk was warm, and I think it's a national thing. So I think multiple people have said, please tell Andrea this. So I'm being a voice there. But I'm sure if that sort of thing happened in the US as well, in terms of forcing students to drink milk.
Well, I'm really sorry that you all had to endure that. And there is a forcing of milk drinking, anecdotally at elementary schools. It'll be like, you could throw out your lunch tray, but you can't leave the cafeteria until you've drunk your little bottle of milk. But I'm not aware of it being warm, and that just seems like a really just harsh thing to do to kids.
Yeah, definitely a thing that's impacted on the British characteristic for a couple of generations now, maybe.
A shared collective.
A shared collective grief, maybe. So let's get quite serious now. So you've been talking about the USDA subsidy program as being part of underpinning a structure that is food oppression. So with that in mind, what are your thoughts on how to change this? How could this be retargeted? How should we be actually reshaping the food system? Because I'm sure in multiple, not just the US, there are multiple policies designed globally that are intending to support an industry for very good reasons, but they may be implicitly or explicitly causing these food oppression. Where can we start to think about how we can design better policy? So with the example of USDA or going broader, how can we start to think about designing this better policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one has to be that corporate interests are not represented in these programs, right? I mean, they need to be designed for people's health, with people's health in mind, and then, equity and all kinds of other issues, but not to support corporations. And so without first taking that step, I don't think there's any hope of having good programs, right? So, I mean, nutritional science is another sort of interesting area, but these things should be driven by, medical research, nutritional research, scientific research, and for good, only for people's good, not for corporate good.
And I'm just following on. So we also have some questions dealing with thinking around prescription. So doctors actually giving prescriptions as an intervention.
Mhm.
Do you feel that that is a positive way to increase access to more healthful foods, as it were?
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I've just started reading about it, the food
Okay.
prescription. Yeah. I mean, it sounds good, but I haven't read any in-depth critiques or anything yet, so I'm not sure how it's playing out. But I certainly personally believe that food can be healing, and that, the sort of opposite, that a bad diet can be harmful. So I think it's worth trying at least.
Okay, wonderful. Just to ask, so people have also been asking in the chat around the role of ultra processed foods within oppression. So you mentioned the term food swamps earlier. People able to only get certain types of food within there, and it seems that ultra processed food might be that only sort of food. Do you want to expand in terms of your thoughts on the role of ultra processed food as a category within this food oppression framework?
I hadn't thought about it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's
And I
interesting.
guess if you're wanting the other question, ultra processed food was talking about the rise of ultra processed plant-based food.
Oh yeah.
So the vegan vegetarian rise. So and basically I was torn between fixing with that. There was another question as well, which is asking around meat and masculinity, and the oppression slash power dynamics within meat and meat, the labor industry, as well as meat being consumption. But again, that may not be your area of speciality.
Yeah, I mean, it's all fascinating to me. I'm vegan myself, so I also try to be a healthy vegan and not eat all of the, the fake, really processed foods. And that's just my personal choices. I think here there's so many issues, right? Because we're also looking at sustainability and climate change and, vegan plant-based diets for those reasons, right? Where we're not thinking about health and nutrition, and we're thinking more about how that diet can be good, maybe for everybody, even if it's not personally that much healthier, you know? And then, yeah, I love the work on meat and masculinity. There's some scholars in Canada who I think do amazing work on this, like Angela Lee in Toronto. And I just read that and I love it. But it's not an area that I'm specializing in.
No, like again, the area you've brought to the table tonight is so broad and so hard hitting. That we can't cover everything in this short amount of period. So thank you, just for saying some of the other names and highlighting some of these other things, because you are not from the UK, but you're now on this show. You've been here 6 weeks. We've got a few questions in the chat asking about the National Food Strategy that was published last year, the Dimbleby report that you may have heard of. Have you gotten into it? Have you bitten into it at all, or have you engaged at all with it? Nothing yet.
Yeah.
So I think it is a standard question on Food Thinkers for people to ask, what are your thoughts on how it relates, etc. But again, they will have to have you back at the end of your tenure here to give your thoughts on more of your UK take, as it were.
I suppose I'll have to tweet them out now that I'm going to have all these new Twitter followers.
Definitely. Oh no, put a thread together and put it out there. It's worthwhile, because over the time you're here, we'll have the government's response, the white paper coming out, hopefully, touch wood, and that definitely you can hopefully be able to put your food oppression lens onto the policy response that the government is providing for our new food strategy, which will be very, very exciting.
Yeah.
So just looking through, please do put in any final questions. We've only got a few minutes left in the call, but I would hate to miss any other questions there. So we've looked through the different pieces of structure. I guess can we go to more of a methodological question for a second? So there's two questions right at the start, which I glossed over, but in terms of thinking about methods that need to engage, are there any other research methods that you would be excited about using with your food oppression? So what other ways could you be engaging with food oppression, or other methods of studying or using food oppression that you think would be exciting in terms of what studies need to be done?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, like as in terms of data that's missing.
Data that's missing, but also how would, if we could give you the bottomless money pit, or the magic money tree, would it be going into the field, working in food banks, working in schools? Where are the places you think needs to be studied next in terms of food oppression?
Prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really big one. Yeah, any institutional setting where people are literally wards of the government and suffering from food, not just like deprivation and inadequacy, but also food gets used still as punishment, as a form of control, right? So some of the things that I'm exploring in the histories of enslavement, of colonization, of sort of land theft of Mexico and all that are really about the direct use of food, right? So today I focused on this sort of modern food oppression and the way that it's used in a subtle way to create these racial health disparities. But in the past, it's been quite outright, right? So I had mentioned a bit of that when talking about colonization. Same with enslavement, right? You will starve, you will be fed this is your punishment. This is the way that I'm going to create a hierarchy within, a household or a plantation, because using food, right? But we still see those kinds of methods today in incarceration, and I think in other settings. So I'm really interested in that. And I'm an old history major, so I'm really enjoying the parts of my research for the book that I'm working on that are looking into the many ways that food has always been so central to racial subordination in, across geography and time. So probably if you gave me that money, I would just like read all day. And then also get into some archives and then some of the people that I've been fortunate to meet so far being here are working in other countries and working on empire and all kinds of fascinating things. There's just so much to learn. I mean, you could just talk about milk all day and the way that it's constructed societies and relationships, and so.
No, thank you very much. And you've raised some really interesting places to look, and in terms of archive and looking through food history, and these are structural systems that have been in place, and recognizing that these oppressive systems have been in place for centuries. Entire food regimes, as it were, have risen and fallen while these have been built up, and these modes and policies have been built up throughout these times. Just from my own thinking, and jumping off a question in the chat, it's discussing or asking you about your thoughts on the free trade deal that's currently being discussed between the US and the UK, and the ways that food oppression could be linked into that. E.g., that person in the question was saying, I'm meant to be looking out for cheese in the free trade deal, and how much cheese the US might be wanting to export to the UK. But also just thinking that extends through to, say, procurement and meals for prisons, or meals for military, or meals for hospitals. For any of those sorts of procurement contracts can be part of free trade deals. So it was just understanding those other mechanisms, as it were. So some very, very interesting points that you've been raising.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the US really likes to export its terrible food all across the world, right? And so we've seen how that affects other countries, especially when there is free trade, right? Like in Mexico, and how there's also resistance in some countries, right? Who will say, no, we're not taking your McDonald's, or we're not taking your, whatever it is. So they're powerful, but they're not ultimately powerful yet, right? But if you do enter into something like that, then that's like, I don't think it can be a good thing. I don't know.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So just to end with one more, thank you everyone for the questions. I think we've got through about 95% of them, and we've got a few more trickling in now, but just to end on a positive note. So one of the questionnaires is asking around generational change. So going from saying this is a deep-seated thing, structural oppression from the past, thinking about future generations. And there are trends that are showing that younger generations are having different food preferences. They have more food choice. They're more aware, they're more engaged. What other things can we be doing to empower future generations to actually change and fight back against this food oppression? What are the positive things we can be going away from here thinking?
I mean, to me, it's the opposite, because it's always the young people that I see as the leaders that are bringing us forward, right? So I already feel like I'm old and out of date, and they're showing me the way. So I think that what we can really do is listen to young people, listen to those future generations, and let them lead. And then we're going to see fantastic things. I mean, a few days ago I was on an Earth Day panel with this people in Connecticut, Hartford Food System, and the work that the young people are doing on their own school meals is radical, right? It's like incredible reform. And I just sit there in awe listening to all of their projects and demands. And so I really think we just need to listen and let them lead. And then I think there may be some hope for us after all.
Wonderful. That's a good note to end on. But again, can I say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for giving this talk. We've had so many comments saying amazing talk, and some amazing questions have come through. So thank you very much, Professor Andrea Freeman, for coming and giving a Food Thinkers Today. Again, I'm going to applaud and give jazz hands from my side. Please do tweet and show your appreciations. Many people are putting into the chat. Thank you for the talk and into the questions. Again, please do email Professor Freeman. Please do tweet at her with your thoughts and your observations on food oppression in the UK, and do link up and continue these conversations. I feel there's many different ideas coming out of this. So thank you again.
Thank you for your amazing work and for stepping in the last minute. I appreciate you, and I'm thrilled to have another opportunity to talk with you about this. You've got such an extensive knowledge, and we all get to benefit from that. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you very much. And hopefully see the entire community on the 17th of May for our next Food Thinkers webinar, where Kimberly Bell will be talking to about her experience of setting up an independent bakery in Nottingham, England. So again, a really interesting, another different perspective on the food system, very much from the grassroots this time rather than from top down. Some really exciting things. And again, Andrea, I'll have to see you at some point for tea now while you're in this hemisphere, in this time zone, and we'll continue these discussions on food oppression. So I just guess it remains to me to say thank you very much for coming. Thank everybody for coming. Have safe travels back to your own homes, and goodbye from the Centre for Food Policy.